Welcome to Popular History. New content every day. Cardinal Numbers, where we discuss, rate, and rank the cardinals of the Catholic Church. Habemus Pointsam, when it's time to talk about papal elections. Project Veritas, an administrative history of the Catholic Church. The Solemn High Pod, where we look at history through Pope-colored glasses. Subscribe to Popular History wherever you get your pods.
Hello, and welcome to Grand Dukes of the West, Episode 24, The Fearless and the Pitiless. We've spent a lot of time in Paris recently, but to be fair, most of John the Fearless's attentions were focused on the capital as well. But Paris was not the only place where Burgundy's destiny was being decided. While John the Fearless was busy killing his cousin, justifying the deed, and seizing power in France, his brother-in-law, John of Bavaria, the Prince-Bishop-elect of Liege, was in the process of losing control over his territory. But first we need to back up a little bit and explore what exactly was the Prince-Bishopric of Liege and why the people of Liege were so upset with John of Bavaria. The Prince-Bishopric of Liege has its origins in the 900s, when the bishops of Liege were granted control over the county of Huy. In the years between then and 1408, the bishops also gained control of the lordship of Bouillon and the county of Lune. These acquisitions gave the prince-bishops a solid block of territory in the southern Low Countries, nestled between the duchies of Brabant, Luxembourg, Gelders, and Jülich, and the counties of Hainaut and Namur. And I'll include a map on the website in case none of that made sense to you. So consequently, the prince-bishops of Liege became powerful lords in the Low Countries. But Liege was not immune from the social shocks of the late 13th and 14th centuries. In this period, like in Flanders, the burghers and guildsmen began to agitate for more rights and power. Bit by bit, these classes gained more power, and by 1373, a new equilibrium had been reached. However, this equilibrium did not last long. The guildsmen of Liege, inspired by the Ghent War of the early 1380s, took control of almost all of the institutions of the Prince-Bishopric through a violent uprising. But the bishops were not content to see their powers slip away, and they resisted the democratizing movements. Perhaps none as much as John of Bavaria, who was elected Bishop of Liege in 1390 at the age of 17. As Richard Vaughan wrote, John's aim seems, quote, to have been the complete overthrow of the civic constitution of Liege and the transformation of the principality into a hereditary state. Following that aim, while John was elected Bishop of Liege by the cathedral canons, an election no doubt arranged by the Wittelsbach-Burgundian alliance, he never was consecrated as a bishop, and so was technically always the Prince-Bishop-elect, although in past episodes I have been simply calling him the Prince-Bishop. John of Bavaria was authoritarian, heavy-handed, and imperious, and so he quickly alienated the people of his prince-bishopric. The first revolt against John of Bavaria erupted in 1394, and while it was put down without too much issue, another one would start in 1402. The 1402 revolt would not be put down quickly, and would eventually spiral out of control, but initially it was not a terrible threat to John of Bavaria. And so the Prince-Bishop-elect continued in his authoritarian ways, and as we saw, led soldiers on behalf of the Dukes of Burgundy on a few occasions. And when Philip the Bold pushed for France to withdraw from Avignon, John of Bavaria followed his lead and withdrew from obedience to Rome. John would return to acknowledging Rome in 1404, giving the rebels an opportunity to court support from the Avignon papacy. John's alignment with Burgundy also gave the rebels an opportunity to court support from the Duke of Orleans, who was always willing to give aid to the enemies of his dynastic rivals. So in 1406, with John of Bavaria ever more unpopular by the day, his opponents decided to elect a new bishop under the auspices of Avignon and voted to depose John. The new bishop was Thierry of Perwez, and his father, Henry of Horne, the Lord of Perwez, was made regent of Liege. Now this appointment put Anthony of Burgundy, regent and soon-to-be Duke of Brabant, in a bit of an awkward position. John of Bavaria was his brother-in-law, but Henry of Horne was a loyal and powerful vassal to the Duchess Joan of Brabant, and was also serving as a ducal officer in a key position. Therefore, while John of Burgundy and William of Bavaria were willing to give aid to John of Bavaria without a second thought, Anthony of Burgundy had to balance his domestic interests. So as John of Bavaria's situation deteriorated throughout 1406 and 1407, he reached out to his brother and brother-in-law for assistance. John the Fearless raised some money for the Prince-Bishop-elect, and also gathered a small expeditionary force to come to his aid. However, while the money would reach John of Bavaria, the expeditionary force would be diverted to Brabant to help Anthony fight the Duke of Guelders, another ally of the Duke of Orleans. Meanwhile, John of Bavaria's troubles continued to worsen, and by the end of summer 1407, his authority was limited to the area around the town of Maastricht, a town jointly ruled by the Duke of Brabant and the Prince-Bishop of Liege. Still, though, the opposition to John of Bavaria was not universal in Liege. The opposition party, known as the Haydroits, which roughly translates to haters of the right, as in the right of the bishop to wield temporal power, held virtually no sway in the countryside, and the counter-election of Thierry of Perwez was done over the objections of many canons of the Liege cathedral. But while the Haydroits' popular support was not overwhelming, it still outmatched that of John of Bavaria. Furthermore, the Haydroits' support was such that many members were willing to serve in an urban militia, while John's support was mainly resigned and unenthusiastic. So with the bishop's sphere of control now confined to Maastricht, the Haydroits decided to put the town under siege. Unfortunately for John of Bavaria, Maastricht was put under siege the day after the murder of Louis of Orleans, meaning that John the Fearless's attentions were firmly focused on Paris. But fortunately for the bishop-elect, the intense cold of the late autumn and winter of 1407-1408 meant that the siege could not go on for long. However, Perwez and the Haydroits would not give up so easily, and a few months later, in the spring of 1408, they decided to attempt their siege of Maastricht once again. But John of Bavaria wasn't in Maastricht this time. He was visiting his brother in Holland. When he heard that his last base in Liege was threatened, he rushed back with a sizable Dutch force from his brother. The bishop and his army were able to force their way into the city, but the force wasn't large enough to relieve the siege. Once back in the city, John of Bavaria attempted to reach a diplomatic solution with Perwez and the Haydroits. The bishop appealed to the moderates in the besieging force for them to overthrow the radicals, but his words fell on deaf ears. Reportedly, the besiegers responded to John's letter with one of their own, written on tree bark and sealed not with a wax seal, but with cow manure. The proud John of Bavaria responded to this insult by hanging a handful of Haydrois prisoners in front of the besieging force. The Haydrois then responded to that by beginning a harsh bombardment of Maastricht. In fact, much of this conflict will see the use of gunpowder weapons. Maastricht now faced a heavy barrage from the rebels. According to Philippe Contamine, over the month and a half that the town was besieged in the winter of 1407-1408, over 1,500 bombard balls were launched into it, and when the siege was renewed in the spring of 1408, the bombardment continued with over 30 balls a day fired at the city. However, as the use of cannons in siege warfare was still relatively new, and the power of these guns was limited, the heavy bombardment would not break Maastricht, and the siege was called off due to the approach of John the Fearless and his army. So now let's back up to look at John the Fearless's activities. As we've seen so far, the Duke of Burgundy had been forced to put the affairs of Liege on the back burner for much of 1407-1408 due to his focus on French affairs. But as John of Bavaria's situation worsened, John of Burgundy found himself frustrated by the stalling and stonewalling of the royal officials in Paris. And so, as much as the Duke of Burgundy didn't want his enemies to take control of the capital, he also didn't want to lose his influence over Liege. Throughout this period, he was working with his brother, the Duke of Brabant, to maintain control of Paris, but Anthony was definitely less willing to face down the Liégeois. As Henry of Horne was a vassal of the Duke of Brabant, the success of the Haydrois rebellion would mark an increase in Anthony's own power over Liege, even if it weakened the wider Burgundian position. So when the Duke of Burgundy resolved to leave the capital to confront Liege, the Duke of Brabant, rather than supporting his brother, decided to declare his neutrality and willingness to negotiate a settlement. However, at the end of the day, his brother John, as head of his house, managed to secure some support, and the promise that if his aid was really needed, it would be granted. Unfortunately for John the Fearless, when he left Paris for Liege in July 1408, his enemies moved quickly to take control of the capital. We'll look into what exactly they tried to do in the next episode, but this loss of influence in Paris would lead to some attempts by the burgeoning Armagnac faction to aid Liege. Throughout the late summer and early autumn of 1408, negotiations between the Liégeois and John of Bavaria continued, facilitated by Duke Anthony of Brabant and under the aegis of the French crown. These negotiations did not prevent John the Fearless from assembling his forces and entering into an official alliance with his brother-in-law, William, Count of Hainaut-Holland-Zeeland and titular Duke of Bavaria. With the financial help of Dino Rapondi, John the Fearless was able to assemble an army of around 5,000 men, which, when added to the forces of William of Bavaria and their other ally, William, Count of Namur, made the allied army around 8,000 strong. John's force was assembled from all his territories. Knights, squires, and archers were summoned from the two Burgundies, Flanders, and Artois. John was also able to summon men from Picardy, as he was still technically its captain general, and furthermore, other allies supplied troops, such as the Scottish Earl of Mar and the Duke of Savoy. Also included in the host were wagons of supplies, including about 1,200, filled with guns, gunpowder, and projectiles. The army began to assemble at Tournai in late August, but as Tournai was a direct fief of the King of France rather than a part of Flanders, letters were sent to the city on behalf of the king, ordering the magistrates of Tournai to block the entrance of John and his men. The royal messengers arrived in Tournai on the 9th of September, and thus they found that Burgundy and his army were already there. Undeterred, the messengers delivered their demands to the magistrates of Tournai, and not wanting to give his enemies in Paris an excuse to accuse him of treason, John the Fearless left the city a few days later. The army then assembled in Nivelles and Brabant, where the troops were reviewed and the final preparations were made, before John the Fearless and William of Bavaria began their march towards the Prince-Bishopric of Liege. The royal court was still trying to prevent John from crushing the Liégeois. When Liege abandoned Rome, King Charles promised that he would come to its aid if it was faced with an invasion, and now that there was an anti-bishop supported by Avignon under threat, many in the court wanted to honor that promise. However, there was still not the political will to openly oppose John the Fearless in battle, and even if there was, the court did not have the time to assemble an army and bring it to Liege before John would arrive. So instead they sent Sir Guichard Dauphin, a knight in the service of the court, and a few other men to present the Duke of Burgundy with official royal orders for him to desist. And what follows is one of my favorite illustrations of the exploitation of the concept of honor, and an interesting view into the mindset of the late medieval noble. So I'll quote now from the Chronicle of Jean Lefebvre, as it appears in Richard Vaughan's book on John the Fearless. Quote, "The king knew of the large-scale mobilization of the two princes, ready for their invasion of the country of Liege. He therefore sent Sir Guichard Dauphin, who later became Grand Master of the king's household, with others in his company, to the Duke of Burgundy, to prohibit him, in the name of the king, and on pain of severe punishment, from attacking the Liégeois, or entering their country." Now it is true, when Sir Guichard Dauphin and his companions reached the Duke of Burgundy and Duke William, they had already entered the territories of Liege. But notwithstanding this, Sir Guichard accomplished what the king had charged him with, and made the above-mentioned prohibition. To which the Duke of Burgundy replied that he had been, and still was, ready to obey the king, but he had gone so far and was so near his enemies that he could not withdraw without great shame. He knew well that the king would not wish him to dishonor himself, and, after addressing several remarks to Sir Guichard Dauphin, he asked him, as his friend and relative, if he would help him, adding, "You have fulfilled your obligations and are no longer an ambassador. As Sir Guichard Dauphin, will you help me defend my honor?" Sir Guichard replied that it seemed that he could not return honorably without a nearer view of the enemy, and stated that he was ready to live and die with Duke John in combat with the rebel Liégeois. He had secretly brought his armor with him, packed in baskets, and, when his companions realized his intentions, they too resolved to arm themselves. And because they had no armor, the Duke provided them from his armory. Thus, they decided to fight with the Duke of Burgundy. Now, isn't that something? Vaughan does give a disclaimer that Lefebvre may have embellished his account, as he was a Burgundian partisan and would later become a Knight of the Golden Fleece. But I still think that the account is so fascinating, especially when you consider the dual roles and divided loyalties that so many people must have had in the lead-up to the Burgundian-Armagnac Civil War. We're fortunate to also have an account of the Othee campaign in John's own words. In the aftermath of the battle, the Duke of Burgundy wrote a letter on it to his brother, the Duke of Brabant. My account will heavily draw from this, with the caveat that this letter was meant not only for Anthony of Burgundy, but also for John's political allies and enemies, so some skepticism should be read into it, as it was not free of propaganda. John the Fearless's account of the battle has the Liégeois force numbering around 32,000 men, about 4 times the number of his own. But Richard Vaughan notes that this number is likely more than double what actually met the dukes at Othee. Regardless, the forces of Burgundy and Bavaria were massively outnumbered, but here the quality of the soldiers makes all the difference. While much of the Liégeois force was indeed made up of trained militiamen, their experience paled in comparison to the largely professional army of the dukes, and a larger portion of the Haydroits army must have had little to no experience in battle. The Haydroits army, being one of enthusiastic and independent-minded volunteers, was also much less disciplined than the Burgundian-Bavarian force was. Furthermore, John the Fearless was no longer the inexperienced and rash commander that had faced Bayezid the Thunderbolt at Nicopolis. At Othee, the Duke of Burgundy would not merely rely on the heavy cavalry charge. Not that he didn't use a heavy cavalry charge, but he didn't use it as a one-size-fits-all solution. So before I get too ahead of myself, let's back up just a bit. After Guichard Dauphin attempted to stop and then joined John's army, the army split up and took different routes into the Prince-Bishopric before joining up again near the town of Tongres, a bit north of the city of Liège and east of Maastricht on September 22nd. Notably, they did not actually enter Tongres, as the town had declared for the Haydroits. It was near Tongres that John the Fearless and William of Bavaria learned that upon hearing of their arrival in the Prince-Bishopric of Liege, Henry of Horne had raised the siege of Maastricht and was on his way towards them with his Haydrois army to prevent the dukes from marching on the city of Liege. Henry of Horne knew that his soldiers had the disadvantage in open battle, and so suggested that they dig in the fortresses and cities of the Prince-Bishopric to starve out the Burgundian army and harass them with guerrilla tactics. However, the Haydrois leadership, possibly thinking of the Battle of the Golden Spurs and their overwhelming numerical advantage, demanded that they face the Burgundian army in open battle. The next morning, John and William sent scouts to find out if the Haydrois were indeed on their way. When the scouts returned, they reported that the Liégeois were approaching and ready for battle. John was caught off guard by the rapidity of the Haydrois approach, but acting fast, he and William summoned their soldiers and began to march until they found a decent defensive position near the small town of Othee. They then deployed their troops all together, with archers and crossbowmen guarding each flank in order to resist the superior numbers of a possible Liégeois charge. The Liégeois then approached, but halted about 3 bowshots away from the Burgundian army, also in defensive terrain, and began an artillery bombardment. The damage done by the guns should not be overstated, as these weapons were fairly inaccurate and took a long time to reload, but the bombardment did have a demoralizing effect on the ducal army. After it became clear that the army of Liège would approach no further, John decided to begin a slow, steady march towards them. But this approach did not include the entire army. About 1,400 men were set aside and led by Jean de Croix, remember that family name, and a few other Burgundian officers, went off in another direction. When the Haydrois saw this, they first thought that a significant portion of the Burgundian army was deserting, and that this might lead to a full Burgundian retreat. But this was not the case. Rather, this force was planning to attack them from the rear. The Liégeois then began their approach as well, and when the two armies met, intense fighting began. This lasted for about an hour, with neither side gaining much of an advantage, until the Burgundian flanking force charged in. Once the noose closed around the Haydrois army, the battle turned into a slaughter. In his letter, John claimed that around 25,000 men were killed, including Henry of Horne and his son, the anti-bishop Thierry of Perwez, but again, these numbers should be scaled down. Regardless, a vast number of Liégeois died in the battle, while the Burgundian-Bavarian army had relatively few casualties. In the aftermath of the Battle of Othee, the rebellion against John of Bavaria collapsed, and the Prince-Bishopric was at the mercy of the dukes. Once more, John fought well in the battle, and this time his strategic sense paid off and his command was effective. He worked closely with his captains to create a coherent battle plan, and his use of the flanking force was the decisive element in his victory. Now I know that in my episodes on the Nicopolis Crusade, I said that John the Fearless gained his cognomen there, but several chroniclers also claim that Othee was where he got the title Sans-Peur. When he heard of the results of the battle, John of Bavaria came to greet John the Fearless and William of Bavaria, and once the three princes were together, they received the submission from many of the towns of the Prince-Bishopric, including Tongres, the industrial city of Huy, and Liege itself. The towns were forced to hand over several leaders of the rebellion, and for the most part, the general population was spared bloody reprisals. John, and William then headed towards Liege to impose themselves on the capital of the rebellion. The dukes made camp outside of the city, while John of Bavaria entered with a company of men. Now, while I just said that the general population was spared, this mercy did not apply to the leaders of the rebellion. The secular leaders were beheaded, while the ecclesiastical leaders were drowned in the Meuse, as there were prohibitions against shedding the blood of the clergy. These bloody, and not so bloody, reprisals earned John of Bavaria his own sobriquet, the Pitiless. But the punishment did not stop there. 500 hostages were taken from the Prince-Bishopric, and the next month John the Fearless held a council in Lille to determine the terms of the peace that would be imposed on Liege. This conference included not only John the Fearless, William of Bavaria, and John of Bavaria, but also William Count of Namur, who helped lead the soldiers in the battle, and John's brothers Anthony, Duke of Brabant, and Philip, Count of Navarre and Rethel. While Anthony had declared his neutrality in the conflict, he had spent the days leading up to the battle on the border of Liege and Brabant with his army, likely stationed there as a reserve for John the Fearless to call upon if things began to go south. The final terms were harsh, and among other things included having all the rebellious towns of Liege surrender their charters to John the Fearless and William of Bavaria, the abolition of guilds in those towns, a prohibition on assemblies without John of Bavaria's permission, limitations on who could be elected or appointed as officers of the towns, and the destruction of several fortresses and city walls in the Prince-Bishopric. John the Fearless and William of Bavaria also gained the privilege to enter and move through the Prince-Bishopric of Liege with or without soldiers at any time, to prevent John of Bavaria from granting new privileges to the towns of Liege, to ensure that their minted currency was accepted in the Prince-Bishopric, and a large fine of 220,000 francs to be split between them. These terms proved to be so harsh that they actually alienated John of Bavaria, who now saw his power in Liege mostly threatened not by the Haydroits, but by his brother and brother-in-law. The Prince-Bishop-elect, now more secure on his throne, changed tactics, and now put himself forward as a champion of the people of Liege and opposed these terms. John of Bavaria's about-face would pay off, as the next year another conference between John, and William would see some of the harsher terms lifted and the return of the town charters. Over the next few years, John would work to restore the independence of the Prince-Bishopric, and for the rest of his term as Prince-Bishop-elect, he would work with the people of Liege rather than against them. Although, it should be noted that the memory of Othee and the threat of a repeat intervention must have significantly strengthened his position, and did as much to prevent another rebellion from breaking out as John of Bavaria's cooperation. But while many of the terms imposed on Liege were lessened, the 220,000 franc fine would remain. This meant that while John the Fearless and William of Bavaria did initially shoulder a significant expense for the Othee campaign, it would be paid back, and the dukes were able to profit from it in the end. And John the Fearless's profit was not only monetary. As Richard Vaughan wrote, Othee, quote, was a crushing and tragic setback to the political aspirations of the urban populations of the Low Countries. Without damaging his own territories, and without alienating the sympathies of his own towns, John the Fearless had struck a blow for the prince's authority against urban privilege and civic liberty, which could serve as a severe warning to the turbulent elements in the cities of Flanders. Another benefit was reaped by John from his victory over the Liégeois, for his position in France, uncertain or even insecure ever since the murder of Louis of Orleans in November 1408, was thereby strengthened and consolidated. But as I noted earlier, John's absence from Paris did allow his enemies in the capital to take control of the reins of government, at least for a time. As much as the victory at Othee strengthened his influence over the Low Countries and his reputation as a military leader, the breathing room it gave his enemies was exploited by them to denounce the Duke of Burgundy and work to exclude him from power. However, the maintenance of that position was dependent upon a Burgundian defeat in Liege. When news of John's victory reached Paris, his enemies began to panic. Soon John would return to the capital, this time as a conquering hero. Who now could stand up to the powerful Duke of Burgundy? Next time, we're going to see how John's enemies used his time away to attack him, how they reacted to his return to Paris, and the emergence of the Armagnac faction. Thank you so much to my patrons. I'm happy to announce that once more we have 2 new patrons to thank, Uldis, Duc de Chimay, and Diana, Graf von Beersel. And additional thanks to Christine, Comte de Chenonceau, Elliot, Graf von Kravenstein, Anthony, Comte de Chateauneuf-en-Auxois, James, Graf von Temsa, Preston, Comte de Saint-Fargeau, Nicholas, Comte de Comarin, and Mark, Comte de Meursault, and to my Knights of the Duchy. If you want to join them, you can at patreon.com/ValoisBurgundy. If you want to support the podcast in other ways, you can do so by leaving a review on your podcast app of choice and telling your friends about the show. Both really help to grow the show and will earn you my everlasting appreciation. If you want to keep up with the show, you can follow me at Valois Burgundy on Twitter or find Grand Dukes of the West on Facebook. You can also email me at granddukesofthewest@gmail.com and check out the podcast website for maps, images, sources, and more at granddukesofthewest.com. Once again, thank you for listening.